Anytime we're presented with information, it's important to look at the content and the context. The content is the part that's shown to you on your screen. That is the part that you're supposed to focus on. The context is what's going on behind the scenes, what's going on outside of the frame of the shot or the scope of the article. So take, for example, here we see a polar bear on a melting chunk of ice, and you think, oh no, it's global warming. But what is the greater context to that picture? There's ice that freezes over every single year up in Alaska, and every single year it melts. You don't think that this polar bear is actually standing on the remnants of a glacier. And once you see through the trick, it doesn't work anymore. Here's another good example. We've got AOC crying outside of the migrant camp here, and she looks so devastated. But then when you pan out just a little ways, you can see the fence she's standing next to actually ends just inches outside of the frame, and what she's looking at is an empty parking lot. Also, as a side note, this is a recreation of the scene from Terminator 2, where Sarah Connor is watching a playground when a nuclear bomb hits, and a group of children are playing outside. Here's the famous picture of Anderson Cooper. He's up to his chest in floodwater. It's so dramatic. Oh man, I hope he doesn't get swept away. And then, of course, you pan out, and the camera crew is up to their ankles, and he's standing on his knees. Here you can see the content. Comedian Owen Benjamin. Uh-oh, I think he's trapped in a forest fire. Man, I hope he got out of there okay. And then the context. Oh, he's just doing a little CNN joke, standing on his knees too. Here's the picture of the Syrian girl who tweeted support for Donald Trump after his missile strikes. That's the content. Well, what's the context? Well, the greater context is this girl at the time of this article, she wasn't in Aleppo. She was living in Turkey. Where'd she get this sign? Who wrote it in English? Who tweeted it? Why did it trend? Where is this pile of rubble really? Was it actually caused by missiles? I doubt it. It's sitting there in Turkey. All of these things are the greater context. Don't fall just for the content. Tim Pool called it mission-driven storytelling. It's what the news has become, and I really like that. Mission-driven storytelling. They take this content and they take it completely out of context to fulfill particular policy or agenda goals. And I say all this because I want to also point out that it can be done with words, not just pictures. I want to briefly run through an article that says a glacier the size of Florida is becoming unstable. It has dire implications for global sea levels. And just in the headline right there, I want to point out they picked Florida. They didn't say Missouri. They didn't say Wisconsin or other similarly sized states. They picked Florida because it's a very easy state to visualize the shape. And so here's a quote from an editor, Kim Master, of Vanity Fair. She doesn't work for Time, but I think it's an important idea to keep in mind. She says, anyone who is familiar with the editing process of a big magazine like Vanity Fair, or presumably Time, would know that the story the writer turns in goes through numerous layers of editing, fact-checking, and legal review. Not all things in the writer's version make it into print. And so keep in mind, every word you read is combed over by editors, other writers, by a legal team. Nothing just happens to appear in this magazine. It's all vetted. So here's our content. a glacier the size of Florida is becoming unstable. And I won't bore you with this. We're all familiar with the general global warming story. It's melting, it's getting out of control. But it's interesting because they talked to this Alex Roble, a glaciologist and assistant professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology, and he brings up some concerns. He does the usual. It's distressing to realize that we can't go back. The damage is done. But there's a couple of caveats, and remember what I said about everything being highly edited and vetted through lawyers and editors. Roble, the scientist, said they used mathematical analysis and computer models to make projections of sea levels in the future. Okay, remember, it's models. They're not scientific experiments reproduced or anything following the scientific method. It's like a financial model. We saw how that worked in 2008. But they're trying to understand scenarios of how sea levels might rise. But this is the interesting part. There's always going to be some level of uncertainty. And this is in Time magazine, who I'm pretty sure we've seen this science is settled stuff. There's always going to be some level of uncertainty in terms of our future projections. So the models are wrong. They're not accurate. They're guesses. They're reading tea leaves. Or the mathematical term, it's extrapolation, which is the most dangerous thing you can use mathematics for. He says, but that doesn't mean we don't know some important things. Well, if your models are wrong, what do you really know? And then again, this went through a legal team, and they added this caveat. The bigger picture is there are some wild cards in the deck here, and the more we've learned over the last few years, the more uncertainties are increasing. So the more we've studied climate change, the more uncertain we actually are. I mean, that's an amazing statement to come from Time magazine. The more we study, the less we realize we know. So Larder, who has studied Antarctica for 15 years and has traveled to Thwaites on scientific expeditions with the International Thwaites Glacier Collaboration, a partnership of scientists from the US and the UK, says, part of the aim of what we're doing as scientists is trying to constrain the uncertainties. Okay, that's 3 times. And give better predictions. So that's an admission that their predictions were wrong in the past. So if you were believing in global warming back in 2006, here they are admitting that they were wrong, but they're trying to get better. But in some ways, the more we're finding out, the more uncertainties we're discovering. Isn't that interesting? Time magazine, been raising the alarm like, most left-wing and globalist publications, but they've really been big on this for a long time, and they have to have this at the end of the article. The more we learn, the less we know. We're more uncertain now than ever. Well, why? Well, here's the problem and the consequence of scientific and mathematical extrapolation. Bombshell claim: scientists find man-made climate change does not exist in practice. A new scientific study could bust wide open deeply flawed fundamental assumptions underlying controversial climate legislation and initiatives such as the Green New Deal, namely the degree to which climate change is driven by natural phenomenon versus man-made issues measured as carbon footprint. Scientists in Finland found practically no anthropogenic or man-made climate change after a series of studies. During the last 100 years, the temperature increased about 0.1 degrees Celsius because of carbon dioxide. 100 years, 0.1 degrees Celsius. The human contribution was about 0.01 degrees Celsius, the Finnish researchers bluntly state in one among a series of papers. This has also been collaborated by a team at Kobe University in Japan, which has furthered the Finnish researchers' theory. New evidence suggests that high-energy particles from space, known as galactic cosmic rays, affect the Earth's climate by increasing cloud cover, causing an umbrella effect. And this was released and published in the journal Science Daily, so this is legitimate stuff. The findings are hugely significant given this umbrella effect. An entirely natural occurrence could be the prime driver of climate warming and not man-made factors. It also means that the models are completely wrong because they haven't been taking this into account, meaning they're useless. So, the IPCC has discussed the impact of cloud cover on climate, but this phenomenon has never been considered in climate predictions due to the insufficient physical understanding of it. How do you build a model if you don't understand it? How do I model, say, a stock portfolio if I don't understand the stock market? Or the impact of earnings or interest rates. It's like this is a very key clouds. It's kind of important to the weather and climate. No experimental evidence for the significant anthropogenic or man-made climate change, the Finnish scientists find that low cloud cover practically controls global temperatures, but that only a small part of the increased carbon dioxide concentration is anthropogenic or caused by human activity. We have proven that the GCM models used in the IPCC report AR5 cannot compute correctly the natural component included in the observed global temperature. The reason is that the models failed to derive the influences of low cloud cover fraction on the global temperature. A too small natural component results in a too large portion for the contribution of the greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. That is why this represents the climate sensitivity more than 1 order of magnitude larger than our sensitivity of 0.24 degrees Celsius, because the anthropogenic portion in the increased CO2 is less than 10%. We have practically no anthropogenic or man-made climate change at all. The low clouds control mainly the global temperature. So it goes on. Conclusions from both the Japanese and Finnish studies strongly suggest that Alexandria Cortez's drastic measures to cut carbon emissions would ultimately require radical legislation to remake the U.S. economy. They would not only potentially bankrupt everyone, but simply wouldn't work. Rip the Green New Deal. Consider the following conclusions from the Finnish studies. During the last 100 years, the temperature increased about 0.1 degrees Celsius because of carbon dioxide. The human contribution was about 0.01 degrees Celsius. Because the anthropogenic portion in the increased carbon dioxide is less than 10%, we have practically no anthropogenic climate change, the researchers concluded, and the team in Japan has called for a total reevaluation of current climate models, which remain dangerously flawed for dismissing a crucial variable. If we pay attention to the fact that only a small part of the increased CO2 concentration is anthropogenic, we have to recognize that the anthropogenic climate change does not exist in practice, the researchers conclude. So when you look at all this new information and compare this with the models of the past, and you look at the past 100 years of human industrial activity on the global scale, all of the fossil fuels being burned, all of the automobiles, all of the coal, all the mining operations, the forest fires, every pollutant that mankind has been pumping into the air by his industrial activity for the past century, and you see 0.01 degrees Celsius of climate change, that means there's no man-made global warming at all.